The House will be in order. The prayer will be offered by guest chaplain Deacon Dan Bournay, Diocese of Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Let us pray. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Melt us, mold us, fill us, use us. Direct our actions by your holy inspiration and carry them on with your gracious assistance so that every prayer and work of ours may begin with you and through you be brought to successful completion. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Amen.
Amen. The chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House the approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Without objection, the gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to give a quick shout out and recognition to our guest chaplain today, Deacon Dan Bournay. Deacon Bournay, and nothing to take anything away from the Almighty Father. I think his voice is often confused with the Almighty in Tiger Stadium in Death Valley, as over and over again, to the frustration of our guest teams, hearing first down Tigers, hearing chance of rain never, hearing touchdown Tigers over and over again. Bournay has been a longtime friend, his wife, a Catholic school teacher, his son Jason, one of my best friends in high school, David, Rebecca, and Elizabeth, the other kids in the family, leading them in a life of faith and now leading our entire community as deacon in the East Baton Rouge Catholic Church. I appreciate him being here today. I welcome him and certainly welcome his prayer, as we need much more of that here today. Yield back.
The Chair will entertain up to 5 further requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is now recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I, too, want to thank our guest chaplain, Dan Bournay. For so many years, over 30 years, I've known Dan and known him wearing many different hats. Anybody in Louisiana that's encountered a number of different interests, whether it's philanthropic, religious, business, you've run into Dan Bournay. I knew him through the Louisiana Chemical Association as the head, representing thousands of workers throughout Louisiana, making things that all of us use in our everyday life, and making sure that those great men and women have the ability to do their jobs with the pride that they have. That was the first role that I really got to know Dan Bournay and his dear friend Greg Bowser. And then, of course, as an LSU alum, when you're in Tiger Stadium, everybody knows that voice. And when you hear the voice of Dan Bournay, it is just one that gets people excited, most people excited. There are other people in Tiger Stadium that might not be as excited when they're on the other end of what happens in Death Valley, but Dan is the one that really keeps things going, that is the voice of the LSU Tigers. And then, of course, his role as a deacon, as also a spokesperson for the Diocese of Baton Rouge. Dan Bournay wears many hats, but he wears them all with great pride and distinction. Somebody who carries himself the way all of us should, a true man of God. We're honored to have him here. Glad he was able to open the House up in prayer today. God bless. Dan, great to have you. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Madam Consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Beginning tomorrow, there will be thousands and thousands of events, commemorations, and activities all over America celebrating Juneteenth Day which will be June 19th. There will be many of those in the district that I represent, at Malcolm X College, also at the JLM Center. I look forward to participating with many of my constituents as we remember, recall, but project the future. And that's what Juneteenth means. We look back to go forward. Happy Juneteenth Day to all of the constituents in my district and throughout America, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, the Constitution is clear. The people's elected representatives, Congress, have the power to legislate, and the courts have judicial authority. Unfortunately, in recent years, those powers have been diluted by overreaching and unelected administrative branch bureaucrats that believe they are the sole arbiters when it comes to administering policies, not the American people through their representatives. Regardless of which political party is in office, both Republicans and Democrats alike should be concerned about willfully giving away their constituents' voices when deciding pressing matters. The Separation of Powers Restoration Act, which I am proud to support, would restore a separate but equal government our founding fathers intended and give back to the people, the American people and their representatives, the capacity to make policy. This is as common sense as it gets and should draw wide bipartisan support. I urge all members to join me in voting yes on H.R. 288. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
I ask permission to address the House for 1 minute and revise.
Without objection, you are now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I want to call attention to the passing of the former Speaker of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, David Bartley. Speaker Bartley was one of the most talented and gifted legislators I have known. His legislative prowess brought about Chapter 766 so that the mentally and physically challenged might be guaranteed a sound public education. His measured approach to public life meant that he led through developing consensus and forging historic legislation. Speaker Bartley went on to serve as president of Holyoke Community College, where he brought the college to new heights of widely acknowledged academic achievement. He was also a very successful Secretary of Administration and Finance who oversaw the state's finances. Born to a very modest background, Dave Bartley brought a claim to the city of Holyoke that he loved, and it returned its highest regards to him. Well-read and well-rounded Speaker Bartley, Renaissance man and really good guy. To his wife Betty and children Miles, Susan, and David, our best during this difficult time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, from the United States of America.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, you are now recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to recognize a leader in the American steel industry. Eileen Bradner, the Senior Director and Counsel at Nucor, has worked for one of my district's most prominent employers since 2009. Her hard work advocating for the steel industry here in Washington helped grow jobs in Arkansas's 1st District and at Nucor facilities across the United States. Before leading Nucor's Washington office, Eileen represented American manufacturers on international trade policy, litigation, and legislative matters for 21 years. Her legislative work included 8 years with Senator John Glenn, where she worked on foreign trade and anti-dumping policies. Eileen dedicated her career to protecting American jobs in manufacturing, representing small and large companies alike. I'm proud to call Eileen a friend. She will be dearly missed as she embarks on a well-earned retirement. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlelady is now recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Each year, I am lucky to work with smart, dedicated students in my district through our student advisory panel. I'm amazed and motivated by their passion, civic engagement, and thoughtfulness. They give me hope. Throughout this month, our communities smile as some of these young leaders are graduated from high school. And to celebrate this milestone, I wanted to congratulate each of my graduates by name. Will Bond, Shrikara Dandy Botla, Emma Eby, Mark Ellison, Michael Gribben, Francis Holcomb, Chloe John, Elizabeth Kokorin, Phoebe Lee, Aditi Mongol, Noah Pletcher, Jaylene Santana, Caden Schaefer, Charlie Sivalakar, Gabriella Thomas. And our task force would not be possible without the care and organization of teachers Alan Malakowski and Jen Statler of the Pennsylvania State Education Society. Thank you both. To each of our students, I wish you the brightest future. Thank you for being leaders in our community. I know you will continue to be leaders wherever life takes you. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition? Sorry.
Madam Speaker, I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to rise and extend my.
Without objection, the gentleman from Kansas is now recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I'd like to honor a longtime friend and Kansans with a true servant's heart, Teresa Brown Foster. 1 minute is not nearly enough time to adequately share all the impressive contributions Teresa has made to Kansas and to Wichita. She was a member of the Library Board, District 1 Advisory Board, Boys and Girls Club Parent Advisory Board, and the Kansas African American Museum Board, just to name a few. She was instrumental in advancing both the Kansas and Sedgwick County Black Republican Councils, serving in various leadership roles, including chair. While her contributions to society are many, her real legacy is the joy she brought to all who around her. Kansans who met Teresa will remember her animated smile, infectious laugh, and warm hugs that were a prerequisite to starting any conversation with her. She loved everyone, and everyone loved her, as made evident by the numerous community leaders and elected officials who sought her friendship and counsel, regardless of political differences. Madam Speaker, I'd ask for a moment of silence to honor this beloved Kansan and my friend, Teresa Brown Foster. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 463, I call up the bill H.R. 288, Separation of Powers Restoration Act, and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 60, H.R. 288. A bill to amend Title V United States Code to clarify the nature of judicial review of agency interpretations of statutory and regulatory provisions.
Pursuant to House Resolution 495, in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee print 118-7 is adopted, and the bill as amended is considered read. The bill, as amended, shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their respective designees. After 1 hour of debate on the bill, as amended, it shall be in order to consider the further amendment printed in Part B of House Report 118-108, if ordered by the member designated in the report, which shall be considered read, shall be separately debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and shall not be subject to a demand for a division of the question. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, each will control 30 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 288.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 288, Separation of Powers Restoration Act, or SOPRA. The Constitution separates the powers of the federal government into a system of checks and balances. Article 1, Section 1 grants Congress all legislative power, while executive power is granted to the President and judicial power is vested in the courts, as we all know. However, since 1984, when the Supreme Court ruled that courts must defer to an agency's interpretation of an ambiguous statute, rather than what Congress intended, the executive branch has begun usurping the legislative branch to issue regulations with the force of law. This consolidation of power departs from the constitutional principles and harms our own liberties. It is certainly not what our founders intended. Yet this 1984 ruling, known as Chevron, has paved the way for unelected bureaucrats to issue sweeping rules with no consequences. Just in 2021, for example, executive branch agencies issued more than 3,200 rules that imposed vaccine mandates on workers. They were also involved in overturning the Keystone Pipeline and required a $15 minimum wage for federal contractors and allowed the IRS to spy on Americans and their bank accounts. Meanwhile, that same year, only 143 bills passed by Congress were signed into law. This means executive branch agencies impose more than 20 times as many mandates as actual legislators. And these regulations are not without cost. According to the American Action Forum, federal agencies collectively finalized $200 billion in regulatory costs in 2021, equivalent to more than $600 per U.S. household. In 2022, we saw an additional $117 billion in regulatory costs added to the bottom line. Taken with rules from previous administrations and according to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the total annual cost of regulation is almost $2 trillion, or about 8% of the U.S. GDP. If we're a country, for comparison, U.S. regulation would be the world's 8th largest economy, only behind France. If members of this chamber impose that kind of cost on taxpayers, well, we know what would happen. We'd all be voted out of office. Yet the Biden administration continues to issue binding rules and courts continue to apply the Chevron doctrine when determining its statutory authority. It's no surprise to see that the president will probably oppose this legislation and promise to veto it. Just 5 months into 2023, and we've already seen his administration circumvent Congress to make changes to non-competes, require climate disclosures by the Department of Defense contractors, and ban the use of pistol braces nationwide. An unchecked administrative state is dangerous to the American people. This is why it's imperative that Congress regain its legislative power by passing H.R. 288. The Separation of Powers Restoration Act would displace Chevron and other precedents that require courts to defer to agency positions. It ensures that courts independently consider what Congress has said through its statutes rather than putting a thumb on the scale in favor of the federal agencies. By forcing courts to apply de novo review, this standard would reclaim the court's constitutional role as the branch that interprets the law, and Congress's role will once again be underscored as the branch that writes them. Agencies are not supposed to make laws, and it is past time to bring the power of legislating back to the branch our founders intended. I want to thank Chairman Jordan for his leadership on the issue, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Wisconsin reserves. The gentleman from New York is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, the so-called Separation of Powers Restoration Act would completely upend the administrative process by eliminating judicial deference to agencies and requiring federal courts to review all agency rulemakings and interpretations of statutes on a de novo basis. More than 30 years ago, the Supreme Court held in Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense Council that courts must give, quote, considerable weight to an agency's construction of a statute it administers. This makes sense because while Congress sets broad policies, we delegate authority to executive agencies because we do not have the expertise to craft technical regulations ourselves, and we rely on these agencies to carry out the policies we enact. Under the Chevron doctrine, courts respect the careful process undertaken by the dedicated professionals at our federal agencies, many of whom have decades of experience and vast technical expertise. Courts give deference to an agency's interpretation of its statutory authority if the interpretation is determined to be reasonable. The Chevron doctrine has been the ruling precedent for judicial review of agency decisions for decades. But this legislation would do away with this long-standing precedent, a move that would throw uncertainty into the entire rulemaking process. It would also empower judges to completely override the determination of agency experts, substituting their own judgment, regardless of their comparative lack of technical knowledge and understanding of the underlying subject matter, for the carefully crafted and scientifically based decisions made by agencies. It is the height of hypocrisy for the party that rails against what it calls judicial activism to support legislation that is the very embodiment of judicial activism. This legislation would also make the federal rulemaking process even more time-consuming and costly than it already is, forcing agencies to adopt even more detailed factual records and explanations in order to withstand judicial scrutiny, which would further delay the finalization of critical life-saving regulations. These are regulations that protect the quality of the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we consume, and the safety of the products we use. But this legislation is just the latest step in the Republicans' decades-long assault on the regulatory process, trying to add hurdle after hurdle on the ability to issue regulations that protect public health and safety, regulations whose benefits consistently outweigh their cost, often by many multiples. Slowing down the rulemaking process for these vital health and safety protections will put the lives of Americans at greater risk. And by eliminating judicial deference to agencies, this bill would empower the courts to make public policy from the bench, ignoring the careful consideration and technical expertise of executive agencies. I urge my colleagues to oppose this dangerously flawed legislation, and I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards, which includes more than 160 diverse labor, consumer, public health, food safety, financial reform, faith, environmental, and scientific integrity groups, and from the Earth Justice.
Without objection.
Thank you. I urge my colleagues to oppose this dangerously flawed legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record a cost estimate for H.R. 288 prepared by the Congressional Budget Office.
Without
and
objection.
at this time, I would, thank you, I would recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and I yield 2 minutes. 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The central architecture of the Constitution is the separation of powers. And it's really just mother's rule writ large. One slice of pie, two hungry brothers. How does mother slice the pie so both brothers are happy? Pretty simple. One slices, the other chooses. The powers given to one brother cannot be abused because of the powers given to the other. That's the brilliance of our Constitution. One brother makes law but cannot enforce it. The other brother enforces law but cannot make it. Article 1 is the first and longest article in the Constitution. It begins with the words, all legislative powers are herein granted are vested in a Congress of the United States. When a law was to be made, the founders wanted a great big rowdy food fight. They wanted every voice expressed through their representatives. They wanted the decision held up to every light. They created two houses with decidedly different perspectives so that the Congress would even argue with itself. And they wanted it hard to make laws so the nation wouldn't be smothered by them. And they wanted those who make those laws directly answerable to the people. But once made, They didn't want laws to be carried out by hundreds of squabbling prima donnas. That's why we have Article 2. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States, one official, independent of the Congress, but also accountable to the people, was to carry out those laws, not make them, but to take care that they are faithfully executed. And then we have Article 3, Mother, the Supreme Court, independent of both brothers, who's there to resolve disputes. How different it is today. Today, executive agencies, which are not elected and often act independently of the elected president, make 10 times the laws that Congress makes. They then enforce the laws that they've made. And if they accuse you of violating them, you have to prove your innocence in an administrative court run by the same agency that made the law, accused you of breaking it, and which keeps the fines that it takes from you.
Madam Speaker, I yield another minute to Mr. McClintock.
The gentleman is recognized.
And while the federal courts give intense constitutional scrutiny to the laws made by Congress, under the doctrine of Chevron deference, they have to give wide latitude to the acts of agencies that lack any checks and balances. Madison warned that when all of the powers of government are in the same hands, you have tyranny. Just ask anyone who's been hauled before this Kafkaesque process. This bill starts to return the law to its constitutional moorings by repealing this despotic doctrine and placing the acts of unelected administrative state under the same constitutional scrutiny as those of the elected Congress. I yield back.
The gentleman yields.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Wisconsin reserves. Gentleman from New York is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield such time as she may consume to the distinguished gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
The gentlelady is now recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 288, the Separation of Powers Restoration Act, SOPRA. If passed, federal agencies would have a harder time protecting Americans from threats to our health, safety, and our well-being. At a time when we need our agencies, with their expertise and resources, to be their most effective. In just one of the most egregious examples, this bill would make it easier for weapons to fall into the hands of the wrong people, endangering countless American lives. For example, it would make it harder for the Attorney General to implement regulations to improve our national instant criminal background check system. I will offer a motion to recommit this bill to our committee, the Judiciary Committee, and to amend this bill to ensure that the AG's rules and regulations around the background check system remains unaffected. The system is used nationally for determining someone's ability to possess a firearm. Its effectiveness is crucial to the safety and security of our communities that are already struggling and reeling with far too many guns in the wrong hands. While Republicans and Democrats are debating on how to address the gun violence epidemic in this country, 97% of Americans have made up their mind. They are angry, and they know we need effective background check systems. As part of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, a bill that was signed into law just 1 year ago, we enhanced our background check system. We cannot afford to go backwards in any way, and this bill would do just that, ignoring the fact that in this country, we suffer the scourge of 48,000 people a year dying of gun violence. More than 60% of those deaths are suicide. 8 children a day die in this country of gun violence. I can't believe I get to say this, or I must say this. Gun violence has become the leading cause of death for America's children. Shame on us. Keeping firearms in the hands of dangerous people, out of the hands of dangerous people is good for American communities. We'll save lives. We'll save our children's lives. We have to save more people. SOPRA, this bill, is a dangerous bill. Thus, I hope my colleagues will join me in voting for the motion to recommit, and I ask unanimous consent, Madam Speaker, to add the text of this amendment to the record.
Without objection.
I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. Gentleman from New York now reserves, and Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Well, Madam Speaker, I would once again just remind everyone that SOPRA is not deregulatory. That has not been the goal at all. The goal is to forward this discussion between what should be legislative powers in the administration so that in the future it also sets a ground floor for many of the statutes. So Congress remains free to regulate in a very detailed way, and so do the administrative agencies. So I've heard this before. We heard it in committee that somehow we were setting up or juxtaposed these two different goals, and it just isn't true. I think that the other thing we would see is that you would find that legislators would do a much better job of drafting bills in the first place. I mean, shame on us if we leave a piece of legislation so vague that it opens the door for an administrative agency to somehow go in and interpret. There are many times where the scope of the legislation is the first thing that should be determined before you even sit down and actually write the bill. So I know it's a criticism that has existed, but I don't think it's valid. And once again, I would reserve.
The gentleman reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York also reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The other thing I would just mention that came up in our discussions during the committee is that when you find yourself in a situation, we just had this discussion in relationship to the REINS Act, where the administrative powers continue to kind of escalate and bloom out from that original piece of legislation. What you'll find is that later on that has to be revisited, because oftentimes it's done hastily, doesn't make sense, is arbitrary in nature, very difficult for legislators to even read through those powers that have been granted and try and make sense of that. So it's another thing that came up in committee that I think is valid. I would reserve.
The gentleman reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York also reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized again.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The other thing I would just relay is that SOPRA does not turn judges into legislators. SOPRA helps to restore the court's constitutional role as the branch that construes the law. Specifically, SOPRA requires that courts apply de novo review to all relevant questions of law when reviewing agency action. This means that the courts, not agencies, will interpret what a law means. In other words, SOPRA enhances, not violates, the separation of powers under our Constitution. And with that discussion, and within that discussion, the interpretation of the law is also something that I think would once again focus where we're at. And I'll yield back. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Lady from New York. Gentleman from New York also reserves.
Reserve.
Reserves. Yes. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
At this time, I would recognize my colleague, Ms. Hageman from Wyoming, for 5 minutes.
The gentlelady from Wyoming is now recognized.
Thank you so much. Madam Chair, over the last few decades, and as accelerated during the Obama and Biden administrations, our constitutional separation of powers has been undermined by Congress's overdelegation of legislative powers to regulatory agencies in the executive branch. H.R. 288, the Separation of Powers Restoration Act, or SOPRA, would begin to rectify this imbalance. SOPRA requires nothing more than for courts to apply de novo review to all questions of law, including agencies' interpretation of statutes and rules. That's what courts are supposed to do under the Constitution. They're supposed to interpret the law. SOPRA would override the ill-advised Supreme Court precedents like Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense Council that require courts to defer to agencies' interpretation of statutes and rules so long as they are reasonable, but even if they are wrong, even if they are incorrect. It would end this improper judicial deference that gives agencies greater leeway to pass rules carrying the force of law and which puts a thumb on the scale of in favor of the administrative state and against the American people. By doing so, SOPRA would help restore the constitutional separation of powers, reclaiming the court's role as the branch that interprets the law, and Congress's role as the branch that makes the law. If we were to look at this issue as if it were a dartboard, courts should be aiming for the bullseye of what a particular statute means and enforcing the legislative intent. Deference doctrines, however, allow courts to defer to an agency's interpretation of a statute or regulation if they are anywhere on the dartboard. This is improper, it's unconstitutional, and it needs to change. Agencies often try to avoid consultation and collaboration with the very people who are the experts, the people who must live, work, and often suffer under the rules and regulations that they mandate. It is a case of an all-knowing bureaucracy in Washington thinking that they know better than the people in the real world, the business owners, the farmers, the ranchers, the construction workers. SOPRA also would help to promote the electoral accountability of policymakers by ensuring that it is Congress's policies and not those of unelected bureaucrats that govern the American people. Over the last couple of days, we've had the opportunity to talk about the REINS Act, and today we're here talking about SOPRA. Restoring constitutional order, applying Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, where Congress makes the laws and the executive branch is merely there to carry them out. As I indicated yesterday when talking about the REINS Act, I cannot understand why anyone in the legislative body would want to defer to unelected bureaucrats to be making the decisions that impact the citizens of this country. This body, Congress, was created to legislate. We need to jealously guard our power, our authority, and ultimately our accountability to the American public. Again, I cannot understand why anyone who is elected would argue that we should allow agencies and folks sitting here in Washington, D.C. to be making decisions that affect literally millions of people across this country without any accountability whatsoever. I want to retake our authority to legislate. I want to make sure that this body carries out its responsibilities and duties. For that reason, I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of SOPRA. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields.
Madam Speaker, we reserve, and I would inform the floor leader that we have no further speakers.
Okay. The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York?
And the same is true.
Also
I'm
reserves.
prepared to close.
From New York is recognized to close.
Yes. Madam Speaker, this legislation would allow judges to undermine and second-guess the carefully crafted and scientifically based regulations issued by our expert administrative agencies. It would upset decades of Supreme Court precedent just to further the extreme anti-regulatory agenda of the Republican majority, which puts the health and safety of all Americans at risk. I urge my colleagues to oppose this dangerous legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Madam Speaker, once again, I would just say that by forcing the courts to apply the de novo review, this standard would reclaim the court's constitutional role as the branch that interprets the law, and Congress's role as the branch that writes them. With that, I would yield back.
The gentleman from Wisconsin now yields. All time for debate on the bill has expired. It is now in order to consider the amendment printed in Part B of House Report 118-108. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk would designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-108, offered by Ms. Hageman of Wyoming.
Pursuant to House Resolution 495, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hagman, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. The Separation of Powers Restoration Act, or SOPRA, is great legislation which I fully support. My amendment is simple and seeks to clarify that de novo judicial review applies to agency guidance as well as to agency rules and congressional statutes. Specifically, my amendment explicitly states that interpretive rules, general statements of policy, and all other agency guidance are subject to de novo judicial review. Unlike rules, guidance is undefined in the APA's definition section. Agency guidance consists of interpretive rules that explain how agencies interpret the statutes and rules that they administer, and general statements of policy that prospectively advise how agencies may choose to exercise their authority. Guidance is not subject to the APA's notice and comment requirements and, at least not officially, does not have the force of law, or at least shouldn't have the force of law. Yet we have seen a growing trend of the administrative agencies attempting to use guidance to have the force of law while at the same time avoiding even the APA process. For example, in my private capacity before being elected to Congress, I was part of an effort to push back on the Department of Agriculture's attempt to mandate RFID ear tags on the cattle and bison of our nation's ranchers. The agency tried to force this on the agriculture community through a 2-page guidance document that was posted to the USDA website. This circumventing of the congressional, legislative, and agency rulemaking process would have cost our cattle producers $2 billion to comply with this guidance, all without a single comment or public hearing. Further concerning is that guidance is often not judicially reviewable because agencies then claim that it is not final agency action. And even when it is reviewed, the government then asks for deference to the agencies by the courts. While the language of SOPRA is implicit that the requirement for de novo judicial review of all relevant questions of law applies to agency guidance, my amendment would make it explicit. In closing, my amendment would clarify that agency guidance, which agencies routinely abuse, is subject to de novo judicial review under this bill. Thank you, and I yield back. I reserve.
Gentlewoman from Wyoming reserves. Does the gentleman from New York seek
Madam
recognition?
Speaker, I claim the time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, as agency heads have stated time and time again, guidance documents, general statements of policy, and other agency guidance do not have the force and effect of law, and the agencies do not take enforcement actions based on supervisory guidance. This amendment would unnecessarily require judicial review, de novo or otherwise, of guidance documents that have not been interpreted by courts to be given the force of law. Before I discuss how guidance documents and rules differ, let's take a minute to consider the pure breadth of materials this amendment would cover. Interagency statements, bulletins, policy statements, questions and answers, frequently asked questions, statements of policy, and advisories. Rules and guidance from agencies are not only given different weight in court, but they also are developed through entirely different processes. Rules are made under the Administrative Procedures Act and thus follow a structured process for soliciting public comments, the review of those comments, and the release of any final rule. Agency guidance documents, by contrast, are not made under the APA process. Guidance documents are not subject to public review and comment. When you consider the range of materials that falls under the category guidance, this naturally makes sense. A frequently asked questions page on an agency website cannot and should not be placed in the same category as rules that undergo months and years of review and development. Not only is it wrong as a matter of law to conflate these two classes of documents, but it would also signal to the judiciary that Congress sees them on equal footing, that is, rules and guidance on equal footing, which would muddy the judicial review of agency action. I imagine the amendment sponsor did not intend her amendment to accidentally expand what kinds of instructions from agencies should be given the force of law by expanding the Separation of Powers Restoration Act in this fashion. But in any case, that is what this amendment would do. And if agency guidance were treated the same as a rule, as wrong as that might be, agencies would be chilled and warned against providing much-needed information to the individuals and businesses who seek more feedback on an agency's point of view. They would be very hesitant to answer questions on question lines. Finally, as I noted in response to a similar amendment to the REINS Act yesterday, by requiring agency guidance documents to receive the same review as rules, this amendment would create confusion among businesses subject to oversight from our executive branch agencies as to how much weight they should give agency guidance. Expanding this bill also to require any guidance the agency gives to businesses about how the rules will be enforced is a drastic expansion of the Separation of Powers Restoration Act, and would ensure that agencies provide less guidance for businesses, thus creating more uncertainty for businesses. This amendment is an overstep that would further stifle the work of our agencies. I therefore oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. And I reserve.
Reserves. Gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized.
Yes, thank you. The irony of what my colleague on the other side is saying is that the only time that the courts would be addressing guidance is when the agencies are attempting to enforce it against someone outside of the agency. So again, an example might be the EPA attempting to enforce their guidance against an irrigator in Wyoming because he moved an irrigation ditch. And they've concluded that such irrigation ditch, through their guidance, is actually a navigable water of the United States. Now, fortunately, recently, the Supreme Court of the United States slapped that down and has indicated that the EPA is no longer going to be able to abuse its power and try to control irrigation land and other resources by claiming that mud puddles and such are navigable waters of the United States. But that's just an example. The only time that the courts are going to be looking at guidance is if the agencies are attempting to enforce it. So while my colleague on the other side would argue that these are just frequently answered questions and internal documents, the fact is that this is the way that agencies are circumventing the APA, circumventing the law, and attempting to enforce unofficial documents against the citizens of the United States of America. I would also point out that yesterday we did pass a similar amendment to the REINS Act, and what this does is it makes SOPRIS and REINS consistent in terms of covering guidance documents as well as official rules. And with that, I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, judging from what the gentlelady just said, the gentlelady does not understand the process at all. Courts do not enforce guidance. So we're not prohibiting them here from doing what they do not do to start with. Courts do not enforce guidance. Guidance simply tells people how the courts will enforce the rules promulgated by the agencies. So to say that you can't have guidance is to say that people must act in ignorance and bet their businesses on what the agency will do without knowing it because the agency can't tell them. That's absurd. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Wyoming is again recognized.
I find it so ironic, having been a practicing attorney for 34 years and fighting over these exact battles in court, that I'm having someone who hasn't practiced for decades tell me that I'm ignorant. In fact, the agencies are the ones that attempt to enforce guidance, and I have defended lawsuits along that very line. So while someone who may have sat in this room for years believes that he has the ability to judge what people in the real world deal with, the fact is that agencies do attempt to enforce guidance against citizens of this country. The only thing that this amendment does is says when that happens, the courts are to apply de novo review to the interpretation of what that guidance means. Nothing more and nothing less. With that, I'm ready to close.
The gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman is again recognized to close.
Yes. Again, this is a very simple amendment that says to the extent that guidance documents are before the court for interpretation, the courts must apply de novo review rather than defer to the agency interpretation of that guidance. Very simple, something that's appropriate and ensures that we're following our constitutional separation of powers. With that, I yield back.
Gentlewoman Ills. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
The gentlelady is accurate as to what SOPR would do, and for all the reasons I stated before, it's a terrible bill, as terrible as Raines is. I'm not going to repeat those arguments. But as to this amendment, I don't have to practice law recently. I know how to read a bill. There are lawyers on my staff who know how to read a bill. And we know, as I said before, that courts don't enforce guidance. There's no such thing. Guidance issued by agencies tells the courts how to interpret the rules promulgated by those agencies. That's a simple fact. It's not debatable. So to have an amendment that says there shall be no guidance is to have an amendment that says businesses should operate in the dark and bet their businesses on what an agency might do. That is ridiculous and harmful to business. And I urge people to oppose this amendment as I urge them to oppose the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. Pursuant to the rule, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended and on the amendment by the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman. The question is on the amendment by the gentlewoman from Wyoming. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no? No. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Question is on the engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to amend Title V United States Code to clarify the nature of judicial review of agency interpretations of statutory and regulatory provisions.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Ms. Dean of Pennsylvania moves to recommit the bill, H.R. 288, to the Committee on the Judiciary.
Pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 19, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The noes have it. The motion is not agreed to.
Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Okay, the ayes and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the ayes and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. To Clause 12A of Rule 1, the chair declares the House in recess for a period less than 15 minutes.
The House will be in order. Proceedings will resume on questions previously postponed. Votes will be taken in the following order. The motion to recommit on H.R. 288 and passage of H.R. 288 if ordered. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20. The remaining electronic votes will be conducted as a 5-minute vote. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the question on agreeing to the motion to recommit on H.R. 288, referred by the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will redesignate the motion.
Motion to recommit H.R. 288, offered by Ms. Dean of Pennsylvania.
The question is on agreeing to the motion to recommit. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote,
Mr. Tanadar. Mr. Tanadar votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Ms. Moore of Wisconsin votes aye. Mr. Larson of Connecticut votes no.
yep. On this vote, the yeas are 209.
You gave us a red card. If you already voted no, did you want to vote aye? You gave us the wrong card then. Now we got to change.
No.
I said now we have a change. All right, Larson of Connecticut.
Mr. Larson of Connecticut. Off no on aye. Mr. Larson of Connecticut.
Okay. On this vote, the yeas are 210 and the nays are 220. The motion is not adopted. The question is on the passage of the bill. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. The bill is not passed, and without objection. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, on that I ask for the ayes and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. If a sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
voters voted? Does any member wish to change their vote?
Okay. On this vote, the yeas are 220 and the nays are 211. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourned today, it adjourned to meet at 2 p.m. tomorrow, and further, when the House adjourned today, on that day, it adjourned to meet on Tuesday, June 20th, 2023, when it shall convene at noon for morning hour debate and at 2 p.m. for legislative business.
Without objection, so ordered.
The House will be in order. The House will be in order. The Chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to celebrate the important relationship between two of the largest democracies in the world, the United States and India. India and the United States built our relationship on our shared values for democracy and freedom, but today it is based on so much more. We support India and its emergence as a leading economic power and as a vital partner in promoting peace and prosperity for all. India has grown exponentially in the 21st century, quickly becoming home to one of the fastest growing economies in the world and leading innovation in the fields of information technology, communications, and agriculture. Consequently, India was named the 2023 president of G20, where they have and will continue to work to address major issues in the global economy. Recently, through the UN, India has declared 2023 the International Year of Millets, taking a strong approach on the promotion of important issues such as food security and global health. The Indian community in Georgia's 1st Congressional District will always have my support in generating goodwill between our two vibrant democracies. I would like to extend my best wishes to Prime Minister Modi, and I look forward to seeing what the future holds for the United States and India. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The House will be in order. The members take their conversations outside. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to praise Mr. George Marable of Montclair, New Jersey, and his DLB Lounge. For more than 50 years, Mr. Marable's DLB Lounge was an iconic jazz club in Montclair, New Jersey, and it showcased some of the most talented jazz musicians in the country. But the DLB Lounge was more than an entertainment venue. As one musician said, it was central to the local black community. It was the home of the Montclair Blues and Jazz Festival, and students from Jazz House Kids would perform there. It was a place where local artists could jam with nationally recognized artists. And every night, Mr. Marable would greet his patrons and musicians alike from his swivel bar stool. It was not only a home for jazz, it was a home for black culture. Unfortunately, the DLB Lounge closed last year, but Mr. Marable and the DLB Lounge will not soon be forgotten. It was a place where we could all go and felt our great community. Mr. Marable is a great man, and we appreciate all that he's done for our community. And with that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia, South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth and Mamie Spears, who are celebrating their 80th wedding anniversary this year. When they first met, Mr. Spears would walk several miles each way to visit Mrs. Spears before asking for her hand in marriage. When they married, they decided to call Effingham, South Carolina, in the PD home and have been there ever since. The couple shares a strong faith in the Lord and has raised their large family of 6 children, 13 grandchildren, and several great-grandchildren to do the same. They've always enjoyed fishing and farming together and now live a quiet and peaceful life. I want to extend my sincerest congratulations to Mr. and Mrs. Spears and wish them many more joyful years together. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, last year, in his concurring opinion in the Dobbs case, Justice Clarence Thomas called for the right to contraception to be reconsidered, encouraging extreme Republican state lawmakers who have been attempting to restrict birth control for years. 90% of Americans believe there should be access to all FDA-approved birth control, yet we continue to see states, including my home state of North Carolina, attempt to restrict birth control. I will not stand idly by and watch extreme politicians interfere with Americans' private health care choices. Birth control is essential health care. Access to birth control is key to women's equality, bolstering education and economic opportunity, and ensuring that people are in control of their futures. That's why I'm reintroducing my bill, the Right to Contraception Act, to create a federal right to access FDA-approved birth control. My bill passed the House last Congress with bipartisan support. There is no reason why that can't happen again. I call upon my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in protecting access to birth control.
Time's expired.
Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week I was proud to vote in support of the REINS Act to curb extreme executive overreach. President Biden and his administration have made a constant habit of sidestepping Congress, the people's house, to enact their radical agenda, costing the American people billions of dollars in their hard-earned money. Let's take a look at the list. President Biden's student loan bailout shutting down the Keystone Pipeline, banning oil and gas leases, mandating climate risk disclosures, and a radical ESG rule that jeopardizes Americans' retirement returns, all done without the consent of Congress. In year one of the Biden presidency, the administration finalized more than $200 billion in new regulatory costs. $200 billion. Even worse, in 2022, the administration proposed more than $1 trillion in new regulations, and we wonder why we're fighting inflation. The REINS Act will put an end to the insanity by requiring the House and Senate to approve any major rule before going into effect. It's high time to end the era of federal overreach in Washington, and this bill does just that, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to extend and revise my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I proudly represent Ohio's 13th Congressional District, and this Pride Month, I rise to recognize Queer in Canton as Ohio's 13th Congressional District's Champion of the Week. Queer in Canton was founded in 2020 by Abby Henry and Kirsten Marks, two young, dedicated, and inspiring people who saw a gap in resources available to queer people in Canton and Stark County, and they resolved to make a change. Queer in Canton works to cultivate the LGBTQ+ community in Stark County and create a more equal community in Canton and beyond. During the second annual Stark Pride Festival last weekend, Abby announced that after 2 years of fundraising, Queer in Canton has successfully raised $20,000 in as much money as they need to open Stark County's first community center to support those who identify as LGBTQ+ and their allies. This community center will offer LGBTQ+ residents a safe place to call home, a space where the queer community can socialize, access resources, and have the freedom to be their authentic selves. Once again, congratulations to Queer in Canton for this monumental achievement and for your advocacy this Pride Month and beyond. You are truly making a difference in Ohio's 13th Congressional District and making it the best place to live, work, and raise a family, no matter who you love or how you identify. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to celebrate the newest state champions to come out of Indiana's 2nd District. Last weekend, the Penn High School softball team won the 4A state championship for the 2nd time in school history. Their return as state champs was 24 years in the making for the Lady Kingsmen, and it wasn't easy. To take home the trophy, the Kingsmen first had to go through 2-time defending champs Indianapolis Roncalli. With the score tied 1-1 going into extra innings, head coach Beth Zachary knew that her team was going to do whatever it took to pull out a win. And that's exactly what the Kingsmen did, eventually prevailing 2-1 after an exhilarating 9 innings. So congratulations to Coach Zachary and all the Lady Kingsmen on your big win and an incredible season. Thank you for making Hoosiers in North Central Indiana and beyond so incredibly proud. God bless you, and go Kingsmen.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I ask consent to address the House for 1 minute and to edit and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to honor and memorialize the fallen hero, Riverside County Sheriff's Office Deputy Brett Harris, who gave his life serving our communities. Every day, our law enforcement officers say goodbye to their loved ones and go to work to make our community safer no matter the cost. On May 12, 2023, Riverside County Sheriff Deputy Brett Harris was on duty responding to a request for assistance before he was involved in a serious motor vehicle collision that caused him significant and traumatic head injuries. At only 27 years old, Deputy Harris succumbed to his injuries the following day, surrounded by his family and his wife, Mireya, in a hospital ICU. Today, a wife and a family mourn a loved one, a public servant, and a friend. Let us honor and cherish the memory of a good man, loving son, and a devoted husband who served our communities well and who loved music, the arts, and video games. I ask everyone present on the House floor to join me in a moment of silence for Deputy Brett Harris, his family, and every fallen peace officer who has answered the call, put their lives on the line, and sacrificed themselves for our safety. Thank you, and I yield back.
Pennsylvania. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, on top of the self-inflicted crises the Biden and White House has created, including excessive spending, the assault on American energy, open borders, and a rattled economy, the Biden administration has accumulated over $367 billion in regulatory costs. These overbearing regulations are harming small businesses and hindering growth. This administration seems determined as well to weaken the American energy industry. It's gone after everyday automobiles, drilling, pipelines, coal, and natural gas. But their anti-all-of-the-below energy crusade doesn't stop there. They've mandated emissions rules on air conditioning units, washing machines, refrigerators, and yes, even light bulbs. What a bright idea. And now they're coming after the American family's gas stoves. This is a blatant example of a heavy hand of government thinking it knows best, putting an excessive burden on American families. We must change course and start working for the American people, Mr. Speaker, not against them. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition? Yes. Without objection, the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Happy Juneteenth, Mr. Speaker, and to my colleagues, and I hope that they will celebrate Juneteenth as we leave for this Juneteenth commemoration. H-Res 1001, my resolution to recognize Juneteenth, June 19th, was introduced on June 15, 2020. The resolution garnered 214 of my colleagues' co-sponsors, and it led to the introduction of the first Juneteenth National Independence Act, my bill H.R. 7232, on June 18, 2020. In the 117th Congress, we introduced again the federal holiday on February 25, 2021, and of course was asked by Senator Markey to introduce my bill in the United States Senate. Well, that year was the golden year. That led to both houses supporting the legislation and being signed by the President of the United States. How important this is that this was General Granger's visit to Galveston 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and indicated to those slaves, still slaves, that you are free. This is a day of jubilation. This is a day of freedom. It is a holiday for all Americans. It's the 12th holiday here in the United States. 38 years after the last holiday, I encourage the nation to do so. Thank you, Reginald Adams, for a wonderful mural. Thank you, Representative Al Edwards, for putting that forward in the state of Texas. Happy Juneteenth. Celebrate it.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Federal bureaucrats have usurped more and more power over the American people in the last few decades. Three-letter agencies now regularly enact sweeping unilateral rules without congressional approval or consent of the American people. This kind of governance is not in the spirit of the Constitution. Congress makes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, and the judiciary makes sure the laws are constitutional. Agency rulemaking makes a mockery of the system of checks and balances. This is why House Republicans passed the REINS Act. This bill will allow Congress to rein in out-of-control agencies by requiring our oversight over any regulation that's going to cost the people over $100 million. Congress for too long has abdicated its authority over these agencies, and it's time for that to end. It's been devastating, especially to our rural economies in agriculture and mining and in timber, and it's killing small towns. Instead, they're burning up because they can't get over the regulations to do normal things like timber harvest, etc. The American people elected us to do the job, not the EPA, not the ATF, not the FDA, to make the laws of this country. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Washington seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to extend and revise my speech.
Without objection, the gentlewoman from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to tribute my distinguished predecessor, a true statesman, and above all, a dear friend, Don Bonker. I had the honor of knowing Don personally and can attest to his generosity. When he heard that I was shopping for a suit for my husband at Goodwill, he mailed out one of his old suits for us to borrow. His generosity really knows no bounds. He was a real source of guidance during those early days. He was always able to answer the phone and answer my questions. I will forever cherish our memories and our conversation together. I ask my colleagues to join me in keeping Don's beloved wife, Carolyn, and his children, Don and Jonathan, in our thoughts and prayers. May they find solace in knowing Don's legacy will live on in the hearts and minds of those who had the honor of knowing him. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
I'd like to ask unanimous consent to speak for a minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
As we go home for this 3-day weekend, I'd like to ask my colleagues, because there's been a lot of discussion going on this week about regulation. And as you get around your district, whether you run into people who are in farming, in manufacturing, in banking, particularly in the nursing home field, I'd like you to ask those folks on the difference between regulatory rules that they live under today and 30 years ago. How many more man hours are they spending every week filling out government forms that does nothing to make their bank or farm or manufacturing facility run better? And I think you'll find them saying that they never would have gone into business in the first place if they knew about this blizzard of regulation, that they could not have swallowed it all at once, but had to take a drip, drip, drip over 20 years. In any event, I encourage my colleagues to get out to a different group that maybe some of you don't deal with, the businessmen and women. Like I said, try to find a farmer, manufacturer, nursing home banker, and you will find out that our country is unquestionably poor because the sea of people we have filling out
Gentleman's
paperwork
time's expired.
every week. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and say my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to commend both the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the ILWU, and the Pacific Maritime Association, the PMA, for reaching a new 6-year contract just last night for 22,000 workers across 29 West Coast ports. Now, this agreement is critical for our economy and recognizes the heroic work of all frontline dock workers. They worked tirelessly throughout our entire supply chain crisis to move our economy forward. Now, as mayor of Long Beach, I oversaw our port, which supports 2.6 million jobs across the country. And as co-chair of the Ports Caucus, I am proud to have worked with both sides throughout the entire bargaining process. This deal would not have been possible without the work of President Biden and Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su. Julie's engagement was key and proved why she should be confirmed swiftly by the Senate. This news builds upon today's report that showed inflation has fallen for 11 months in a row. Our ports will continue to fight inflation and bring back jobs. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise this.
Without objection, the gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the men and women who made the ultimate sacrifice in service to our country, I introduce the bipartisan Honor and Remember Flag Recognition Act of 2023 with Representative Jen Kiggins of Virginia. Currently, 27 states, including North Carolina, have adopted this symbol in honor of those killed in action. By supporting the Honor and Remember Flag Recognition Act, we can help the families of these fallen service members find closure. On behalf of these families, I ask all members of Congress to support this vital legislation. Together, let us affirm our unwavering commitment to honoring and remembering our courageous and brave heroes who have given their lives for our freedom and democracy. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the service and the work of Sandy Torres for a lifetime of commitment and service to Santa Ana Unified School District. Sandy was born and raised in Orange County, and Sandy attended local Santa Ana schools. She started working at Madison Elementary School when she graduated from college in 1982. 40 years later, she's still there working and helping children learn and to become good citizens. She has been a 3-time recipient of the Madison School Employee of the Year Award and was recognized last year as a classified employee of Santa Ana Unified. And I'm honored today to nominate her as my Congressional Woman of the Year. Sandy, thank you for a lifetime of service. We honor you, your commitment, and we thank you. Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to commemorate the legacy of Jesse Tafaya Jr., a pillar in the North Texas community who is a steadfast champion for equality, justice, and inclusion. Jesse lived to serve his community. After high school, Jesse worked for IBM and DART for the past 10 years, and he was an active member in many organizations in Dallas, including Rainbow LULAC, Stonewall Democrats, Dallas County Democratic Party, and the MLK Jr. Community Center Board. He was a champion of so many different social causes and issues, and he worked tirelessly to try to bridge the gaps and to create understanding between the communities. He was a very special person, and he greeted everyone with the line, "Hey, don't I owe you a drink?" And this was his way of saying that he cared. And after that, he would listen to people, and he advocated for communities and people that he felt were genuinely left behind. Jesse was an embodiment of service, of kindness, and his legacy will be carried on through the countless lives he touched. His love for family, friends, and strangers was unconditional, and I extend my deepest condolences to all of his family and his friends and everyone in the community who loved him and called him a friend. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the dedication and determination of the Pennsylvania Grange as they celebrate 150 years of service. Their story began in 1871 with the organization of the Eagle Grange No. 1 near Williamsport in Lycoming County, eventually became statewide in 1873. The PA Grange was founded with the intent to heal a wounded nation following the Civil War. Today, the PA Grange has members of all ages. It represents more than 5,440 Pennsylvanians. The PA Grange is honoring their 150 years with 150 acts of service. Each chapter is tasked with completing a service project, and as of Wednesday, June 13th, they've completed 194 projects. It is with full confidence I stand here, honored to represent a state with people dedicated to helping members grow as individuals, unifying their communities, and fostering opportunities through legislation and community service. Mr. Speaker, every year I have the privilege of attending the Grange Fair in Center County, my home county. While attending the fair, I'm able to witness their mission firsthand. The mission of this organization continues to withstand the test of time. Congratulations on 150 years of service, education, legislation, and fellowship. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last week, America and we in Ohio lost a true patriot, family man, and successful business leader and community champion, Taras G. Smagala, who passed away at 90 years of age. To his wife, Catherine, of 64 years, son Taras, grandson Gregory, and vast network of extended family and friends, I know this is a difficult time. Yet I also know that you carry forward in all you do the living memory of your beloved husband, father, and grandfather. Please know many others feel the sharp pang of your loss. Taras inspired us all with his gentlemanly manner, easy smile, and dedicated passions on matters that mean most. There was no stronger advocate on behalf of liberty for Ukraine than Taras. He knew the stakes. His life was a classic, committed to family, profession, nation, and liberty, and he was resolute. He made and kept his promises. He maintained resolve in all pursuits. He was jovial, loving, dependable, and visionary, and he made our world a better place. May he rest in peace as he takes his place at a high altar of praise, as his spirit helps guide our world, including freedom for Ukraine. May he help usher her into the birth of liberty to which he dedicated so much of his life. Sending deepest sympathy and abiding gratitude of friendship. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask the consent to address the House in 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to honor Director of Riverside County Department of Veterans Services, Mr. Grant Gauchi, on the eve of his retirement from public service. Grant, a United States Navy veteran himself, has selflessly attended to veterans throughout California's 39th Congressional District, as well as the entire county of Riverside and beyond, and for the past 25 years with esteemed honor. Since beginning with the County of Riverside in 2014, Grant has served local veterans, their dependents, and their loved ones in obtaining the resources, guidance, and benefits entitled to them. He has worked closely with my district office, ensuring those who have bravely put their life on the line receive the recognition and care they deserve. Grant's hard work and devotion is a testament to the way we should all express gratitude to our nation's veterans, and his retirement is well-deserved. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. You ready? You ready? Ready? Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. The joys of when the calendar has some hiccups in it, we're all running around. Want to do a couple things, and what I'm going to sort of walk through is what we're seeing in the numbers. There is a sense of theater around here that I'm trying to break through. So let's see if we can have some fun with some math. For those who were complaining about the caps, the spending reductions, and the recent debt ceiling, for those that wanted more over here, for some of our brothers and sisters around this place that didn't think any of it was necessary, I need to break through and help this place get its head around the fact that we actually were allowed to negotiate on 11% of the spending. Remember, your government is functionally an insurance company with an army. The vast, vast majority of our spending is on autopilot. It's earned benefits. You earned your Medicare, you earned your Social Security, you max out your you work your 40 quarters, veterans benefits. You get certain things if you fall under a certain income. That's called Medicaid. You get certain things because of treaty agreements, tribal populations. But those aren't formula. We don't vote for them. Matter of fact, it's almost radioactive around here if we tell the truth that it's the vast, vast, vast majority of spending. So I'm going to do some of this backwards. A week ago Friday, two of the lead economists at Bloomberg, they call it Bloomberg Intelligence. You have to sort of go to the Bloomberg terminal to get this, but I subscribe to a couple things where I got the top line. And have you ever started to read something and you go, oh my God, what are they talking about? That number can't be real. And then you bother someone who has an actual Bloomberg terminal and they pull the full printout on it. Here's the reality. And I don't know how to get to folks to actually understand the math. The Bloomberg Intelligence, the two economists said their model, because Bloomberg has this fairly fancy model, just like we do at Joint Tax, at CBO, the Tax Foundation, everyone has their models. Theirs is fairly impressive. Their model said in 10 years we're at 130% of debt to GDP. Now understand, the cuts we just did, the rebalancing, the flattening, the slowing down, the debt growth that we just fought through in the debt ceiling, we sort of took ourselves from 119% of the size of the economy at the end of the decade, or 10 years from now, to around 114. And that's a big deal. You figure 10 years from now you have a $39 trillion economy, 1%, that's real money. So we pulled it down from 119 to 114. Yay! Matter of fact, I think I have a board on it. And then to read through the analytics from these economists saying, here's your problem. Interest is dramatically higher than we've been modeling. They see inflation and therefore interest running longer. They also see healthcare costs growing faster and larger. And if you actually think about the reading you've done this last week, because I know all of us around here read the technical aspects and, whether it... Sorry, I was going to get sarcastic. I'm trying to dial that back. You start to see we're seeing this huge, very substantial spike in Medicare spending. Turns out a lot of our seniors actually had postponed lots and lots and lots of procedures. You just saw one of the major health companies that caters to Part D, their stock just cratered yesterday because of utilization. Then they had some other interesting things in there. So interest is up. Healthcare costs are up fairly dramatically. And then the thing I've tried to explain here, no one gets their head around. Before the agreement, and I'm going to use rough numbers, the non-defense discretionary spending is $700 billion. Okay? We functionally just removed $100 billion. So now it's $600 billion. Just that reduction of that $100 billion over those 10 years, they actually calculated that next year the GDP growth will be down a whole 0.5%. That's huge. Because we were already starting to say, because of our demographics, we've gotten very old as a society and we're getting older very fast. And you all know what's happened to fertility for the last, since the early 90s. Last year we're down to 1.67. So in 18 years, the United States has more deaths than births. Half the states today already have more deaths than births. So you start to say, okay, we're going to be at 1.8. There was a couple projections for next year. We're a little higher than that. If we just shaved off another 0.5%, and then I have folks running around here saying, look at our pretend budget. We can balance in 10 years. We can... Absurd. The borrowing this year. Have you seen the numbers? You realize now you don't do budgeting this way. We have a fiscal year, but year to date, so if you do a 12-month cycle, we have now borrowed 2.1 trillion this year, and that does not have the backfill of all the extraordinary measures that just are getting done right now, as now the debt ceiling has been raised. 2.1 trillion is more than all defense and all discretionary, meaning everything you think of as government, the FBI, the White House, the Supreme Court, the State Department, all of it. All of government is functionally living on borrowed money. We weren't supposed to hit that until for about 9 more years. And we've already hit it this year. So why this board? Look, I hope this is wrong. I desperately, desperately hope these numbers are wrong. But this was Bloomberg Intelligence. Two of their lead economists saying, when you put in these factors of the cuts in spending, which we have to do, but you got to deal with the reality that it does slow down the economy, the higher interest rate costs, the dramatic increase in the utilization of health care, particularly in Medicare and Medicaid, but mostly Medicare, 130% of debt to GDP, that's 9 budget years from now. I beg of someone, pull out your calculator, put some batteries in it, and do a little math experiment for me. If you had 130% of debt to GDP, if today publicly held debt is, let's call it 25, 26 trillion, that's publicly held. That's where you haven't been borrowing from the trust funds, publicly held. You had to go to markets. That's doubling publicly held debt. So let's say it's 51 trillion. You can almost do that math in your head if you said you had a 5% strike rate, which is high. That's well over $2 trillion a year. $2 trillion a year just in financing costs. 9 years from now, the interest cost is functionally equal to every dime you and I think of as government. We were not supposed to hit that for like 15, 18 years. With the higher interest rates, the increased cost of health care, the fact that economy does not look like it's going to grow much more than a point, if we even hit the consensus number of a 1.7, 1.8, 9 years, $2 trillion a year in financing costs. I hope it's absolutely wrong. I hope our projection on interest rates is way off. But this is coming off the Bloomberg model. These aren't slackers. These are some of the best in the world at analytics. So let's go to something that was more optimistic. Moody's Analytics. So it's Bloomberg Intelligence, Moody's Analytics. Their number was much more optimistic. So instead of being at 114% of debt to GDP functionally in 9 budget years, they had it as 121% of debt to GDP. And all understand, we're supposed to be at 114. Even Moody's has a few points above that, meaning we will have broken through the debt to GDP more than the World War II. Just the financing costs, let alone the drag on the economy, because this government, in trying to finance all this spending, and it's, well, we'll come back to where the spending's coming from, is going to consume much of the world's capital. We don't have a high enough savings rate in the United States to have an economy that grows and to finance these. So we're going to have to reach out all over the world and grab stunning amounts of capital. How much discussion have any of us heard this week, last week, the week before that, behind these microphones about dramatically changing the cost of health care? Because when the president got behind that microphone during the State of the Union and said, you're not allowed to talk about Social Security, even though in 9 years the trust fund is gone and we doubled senior poverty. So if you're on Social Security, understand, start planning for it, because we've made it radioactive here to even have an honest conversation about it. In 9 years, you take a 25% cut in your check. Therefore, we're going to double senior poverty. And that's the morality of the State of the Union we had. You're not allowed to talk about it. We won't cut, we won't touch it by not working on it. Well, how about Medicare? The Medicare Trust Fund is also gone in this window. And the Medicare Trust Fund only pays for, 40, I'll be generous, 40% because it's mostly the hospital portion. The rest comes right out of the general fund. So please understand, when you read something like that, and CBO was over here originally before the debt ceiling agreement at 119% of GDP, they brought it down to 114, and then the other analysts are saying, yeah, but you haven't calculated the cost of higher interest. You haven't calculated the fact that as you're trying to start to slow down the growth of spending, you actually slow down the economy. And the healthcare costs are going off the charts. But we're terrified to get behind these microphones and tell the public the truth. So one more time, an oldie but a goodie, and I will make a new slide one of these days. People don't get their head around the vast majority. Don't look at the 1965 date. This is 2022. 71% of all spending in 2022 was just Medicare, Social Security, what we call entitlements. They're earned benefits. Some are not earned. Some you get because you're part of certain groups or certain incomes. Defense was about 13%, meaning the rest of discretionary is 16. We actually took some of that off. You couldn't negotiate on it. So when we were doing our negotiations, we were down to 11% of the budget. This red part of the pie grows and grows and grows. Everything else is flat. This consumes us. And yet we've made it politically dangerous to talk about it. You talked about Medicare. You talked about Social Security. Oh, you're right. My passion, one of the reasons I keep running is I'm trying to save them. It is a moral argument that you deserve to have security in your retirement. Not talk, it's like having cancer and refusing to actually go to the doctor and talk about it. This is a malignancy and it's growing dramatically faster. Just look at the data that came out in the last 10 days of the growth in spending in Medicare. In the first 7 months of this fiscal year, Medicare spending went up 16%. Now, a lot of that's healthcare inflation. A lot of that was seniors who had postponed medical services during COVID. But 16% in the first 7 months. The frustration around here. And so here's part of the punchline. And I don't know when we talk about these big numbers, particularly in a time of inflation, we often use, oh, that's $1 trillion. The more elegant way, the way if we were all officially economists, went out and got our PhD, you would talk about a percentage of the economy because that stays constant. So you can have lots of inflation, a little inflation, but the percentage of the economy that's going to debt servicing, that's going to borrowing. We were projected in 9 years to be about 7.5% of the economy being borrowed. Okay, so you sort of see over here, this is just the running borrowing chart. We had that huge spike substantially because of COVID spending. But in 2023, we were supposed to be at 7.5% of the economy, the entire economy, United States government, federal government would be borrowing. But we're only growing at about 1.8. So you remember that delta, the simple math, 1.8, and over here you're borrowing 7.5. But if we go back, sorry, let's see if I can grab this chart without breaking myself. If you go back to what Bloomberg said, they're economists, in 10 years, that's not 7.5% of the economy being borrowed, that's 13. You're growing at 1.8 and you're borrowing 13% of the economy. This is Armageddon and it's in the 10-year window. And the clown show around here is either terrified to talk about it or we're going to make up numbers. Unless you see budget documents talking about dramatically changing the cost of health care, this starts to become real. And all of a sudden, running 7.5% of the economy in borrowing, will look good. Because if we get up near 13% in a 10-year window, you think we're going to have money for defense? You think you're going to have money for education? You think you're going to have money for research? Where are you going to have any cash at all? You're going to be struggling for every dime you have to keep the retirement security benefits. It's math. It's demographics. What is the primary driver of U.S. debt? Demographics. We got old. Today, for every dollar we spend on young people, we spend $5 on seniors. In the 70s, for every $5 we spent on young people, we spent $1 on seniors. It flipped because those young people were the baby boomers, and they've moved through the python, and now they're here. And we still have about, 6 more years of baby boomers moving into retirement? So what's the number? Like 10,300 Americans turn 65 every day. So many of us, we weren't giddy, but we were pleased we had started to make, and understand, the debt ceiling deal is actually the largest cut in U.S. history. You wouldn't hear that from the propagandists who are trying to raise money from scaring the crap out of you, but it is. So we went from 119% of GDP down to 113. Think of that. If that's our new base, 113, 114. Our math in our office was 114. And I'm not even sure. This is Center for Responsible Budget. They had us down to 113. But our math in our office is, okay, we picked up about 4 points of GDP in reduction in spending. And just the higher interest rates consume maybe 2-3 times that savings. So let's sort of walk through some of what we're seeing. And I try so hard to try to convince people, because if you go right now to sort of our social media for our office, and I'm sure it's for other members here, look at the crazy that you get. If you just cut foreign aid, we could balance the budget. Foreign aid's about 12 days of borrowing. At the end of the decade, it's half that. Just get rid of congressional salaries. Trust me, we're probably overpaid for our work product. But every dime of senator salaries, members of Congress salaries, is like 18 minutes in an entire year of borrowing. We borrow what's our latest number? It was like a little over $50,000 a second. And in 9 years, we're over $90,000 a second. Every day, 7 days a week, 12 months a year. That's per second. And it's all Social Security and health care entitlements. Do you see this delta here? So functionally, you can get rid of every dime of defense, every dime of government. There's no government at all, and you still will be borrowing trillions of dollars at this rate 10 years from now. There's a model out there that we've talked about. Now, this was on the CBO numbers from last February that said in 9 years you could get rid of all of government, all of defense, and you had to borrow $300 billion. That was not with then a couple weeks later we got the data that the Social Security Trust Fund would be empty. And I apologize for talking too fast. I know sometimes trying to take this down. I had a lot of caffeine today. So with the backfilling of Social Security, you add another few $100 billion a year. If these new numbers are correct, we are about to hit the numbers that we were supposed to hit 9 years, and we're hitting them now. And part of that is, and I'm sorry the chart is in the pile over here, tax receipts have taken a huge fall in the last month or two. And if you actually dig into the data, saying, okay, well, what's happened? Well, it turns out it was capital gains receipts, which make perfect sense. Let's say you have an asset. It's gone up substantially in value because of inflation, not because you're more productive, not because it's some incredible technology. It's gone up because of inflation. So if you sell it, you're going to pay all this capital gains tax on inflation. because another asset you're going to go buy has also been inflated. There's lots of data in the literature that talks about when you hit inflationary cycles, the fact you've devalued the dollar, you've devalued people's savings, you've devalued people's retirements, but you also create such a distortion because you don't know what's actually a gain and what's just fluff. It's inflation. And now we're starting to see it in our tax receipts. It's already begun to hit us. So as we start to walk through, and I wanted to do this board one more time. The number of times you hear, particularly our colleagues on the left, talk about, well, you need to just get rid of this debt ceiling. It's not right to have these stressors. It made people nervous. That's part of the point. And I know this sounds like being a jerk, but you got to understand, this place is incapable of doing adult work unless there's a stressor, whether it be the budget or the debt ceiling. So I come here and ramble behind here. I bring my charts. I bring my calculator. You know, I have my handful of PhD economists from the Joint Economic Committee. We do our data. You preach it to your brothers and sisters, both on the right and the left, and they just stare at you. It's not till you have a moment, something like the debt ceiling, where everyone on financial television has their hair on fire, even though it's mostly theater, because we have plenty of cash flow to cover the interest on our bonds. And it requires those inflections. But when we hit debt ceiling, when the Democrats controlled this place, they required more spending. Remember, the 2019 debt ceiling agreements, that bipartisan agreement, it is scored by Center for Responsible Budget as costing that Speaker Pelosi, the Democrat gang, because they ran this place, they took a Republican president and said, we won't pass a debt ceiling unless you spend, in their number, $1.4 trillion. How many of you heard anyone talk about the fact that just a couple years ago, the left demanded more spending? By 1.4 plus trillion, more spending for them to vote out the debt ceiling. And then there's rage from my brothers and sisters on the left that we asked to flatten the spending growth. That's how duplicitous the media is here. And when you talk about numbers and they have lots of zeros, I think people immediately tune out and go hit their Netflix account. But here's the history. When the Democrats have been in charge, we hit debt ceilings, it's more spending. When the Republicans have been here, at least we've gotten some inflection of some fiscal sanity. And once again, I've used this chart every month for probably 3 years now, because I'm trying to get it to sink in. 100% of the next 30 years of borrowing, 100% of the next 30 years of borrowing, interest, Medicare, and if we choose to backfill Social Security. Everything else is flat. The new number on this chart, we had calculated to be about $128 trillion. With the new numbers coming in on inflation and therefore interest costs, we think we may be a few trillion short. Understand what that means. If I tell you right now, hey, 30 years from now, the United States government, when you add in its cost of Medicare and the financing, the backfilling of Social Security and its financing, we've borrowed $130 trillion. If any of you plan to be working 23 years from now, the CBO's own math says the United States will have to double all U.S. taxes. Double all U.S. taxes just to maintain the baseline services. That's nothing new. That's baseline services. This is the reality. And then you have the irony, and we haven't had time to put together all the boards because it turns out it's a lot more than I thought. The incredible duplicity where our brothers and sisters on the left attack us. You're trying to cut things. Okay? So Inflation Reduction Act, which is just an Orwellian title. Goldman Sachs says the actual spending of the grants, handouts, tax specialties for their favorite companies equals $1.2 trillion. We haven't done, what's the financing cost? Remember, that's all borrowed money. So you hand out borrowed money to these favorite companies. This is the Democrat bill, not a single Republican voted for it. What's the financing cost of $1.2 trillion over forever? Because we won't have a demographics balance for what, 30, 40 years before you can actually start to pay down this debt. That's the math. CHIPS Act, here's $50, $60 billion. You got to go to the White House to get a grant, but you got to be nice to Democrats in the White House to get your grant. The number of soft nationalization that the Democrats passed. Now, understand, Goldman Sachs said this would be $1.2 trillion of spending in their Inflation Reduction Act. CBO came back about 3 weeks ago and doubled their estimate. Because remember, when they were voting on this, they told the American people it'll only be $2.8 trillion. Excuse me, 280 billion. Sorry, got to get my math right. $280 billion over the 10 years. CBO just came back and said it's 500 plus, and that's partially with the assumption is you can't get all the credits because you can't get all these components made in the United States. But if you could, yeah, it's 1.2. I know people glaze over when I use math like that. Where I'm simply going with this is the left has spent a stunning amount of money in the last couple of years when they controlled this place. And then they attack us for trying to slow down the spending. And our big is, hey, we want some caps. We want to cut discretionary spending. That 11% of the budget we were allowed to work on, that $700 billion, we're going to roll it down $100 billion over the 10 years. And we're heretics for wanting to slow this down. At the same time, interest and Medicare, healthcare costs explode. So what's the solution? Seriously, what's the solution around here? You mathematically you can't cut unless you're willing to wipe out government to get us anywhere close to balance. We're now heading towards the death spiral of interest. The argument we make is if the predominant driver, actually it's almost all of the driver of spending is healthcare, we got to come up with a way to revolutionize the cost of healthcare. When was the last time you saw members, both Democrat and Republicans, get behind this microphone and willing to have a discussion about obesity? When did you see us get behind this microphone and talk about the stunning growth of diabetes in America? Diabetes, it's type 2. Diabetes is 33% of all healthcare spending. 31% of Medicare. Maybe the discussion of our brothers and sisters are dying in this country, there's something horribly wrong, but we're not supposed to talk about it. Though these are the same people that 30 years ago made the moral argument that stopping people from smoking was good for society and good for those individuals, but today we're not allowed to talk about the fact that we functionally have about 3.5 million prime-age males missing from the labor force. Some of the best data we have says number one cause is probably obesity, number two is drugs. Now it's complicated. People are complicated. But we look at the data and what we did during COVID of forcing people to stay home, the stunning growth of morbid obesity in the United States. Is it moral? Is it moral that we're not willing to talk about it? Do we care so little about our brothers and sisters that we're not going to reach out and save them? So you have some opportunities. You have the farm bill coming. Are we willing to think like revolutionaries? both on what we grow and what we do for nutrition support. Is it moral to hand someone an EBT card, which is the replacement of food stamps? It's the new, better, faster, whatever way, and say, you can use that EBT card to go buy onion rings. Okay, look, I'm someone, I believe you should be allowed to eat anything you want, smoke your cigarettes, but you should also carry your own cost, not pawn it off on the rest of society. If you're willing to cover your own costs, have a party. If the rest of us have to pay for it, because right now it's borrowed money, I have an 11-month-old at home we're adopting. That little boy, when he is functionally 23 years old, his taxes have to be double. Is that moral? Make the moral decision today. Change the Farm Bill. And I know it's politically hard. I know it's a balancing act. But Democrats have to care about people too. At least I hope they do. The second thing I would do is there's now over-the-skin blood glucose monitors. We're told that there's actually now, and forgive me if I won't say the company. One company now already has it in the watch. There's another one that actually has something that would actually calculate your calorie intake. We're told a couple generations from now, even the Apple Watch will have blood glucose in it. If we could stabilize pre-diabetic populations in the United States, it's one of the most dramatic things you could do to stabilize debt. Have we ever had a conversation about that? Can we get the Budget Committee to actually put that in one of their footnotes, that here's a couple positive, Republican, Democrat, because I don't know if we've made that partisan yet, that could actually work with each other to say we need to stop having our brothers and sisters in the country dying. Third one, and this one I will get crap for, is the new GLP-1s. The data is remarkable on how effective they are as appetite suppressants. Do you take, and we're doing the math right now, and it's going to take us another month because it turns out the math is hard if you're going to do it like adults. If you took your populations of Medicare, Medicaid, Indian Health Services, VA, these are government paid for populations, took those who were morbidly obese and said, we actually love and care about you. We're going to give you access to these because we want you to live. We want you to be able to participate in society. And here's one of the punchlines. On Monday, we had maybe the nation's leader in healthcare statistics do a little forum down the hall. His data says, remember, this is the guy with 70 million U.S. health records, and it's used for mining and used for setting up drug trials, but he is sort of the demigod of data. He said there are functionally 4,000 human diseases. 2,000 have direct relationships to obesity. Half the human misery, 2,000. So we're a moral body, right? We care about people. We're going to have oh God, we're not allowed to talk about it, except an idiot like me who's willing to get behind the microphone. So would it be good for productivity? Of course. Would it be good for people's future economic vitality, their ability to save for retirement? Of course. Would it be good for the debt and deficit? Of course. Would it be good for my little boy's future? Not having to pay for the borrowing of today, because that's what we do. We borrow today so our kids and grandkids can pay it off tomorrow. That's number 3, the willingness to actually do the math. What would happen if the GLP-1s, we made a government decision that the math is so compelling, the economics are so compelling, we are going to roll these out in our populations who are suffering. And the fourth thing, on Monday we had one of the teams here that is about to begin their phase 1 on a cure for type 1 diabetes that they believe is applicable to type 2. It's a stem cell that does not require anti-rejection drugs. They lay it into the lining of the tummy, and apparently it produces, these islet cells produce insulin. At the end of the decade, we may have an actual cure. So the math is like this. If someone is a type 2 and type 2 is actually complex. There's lots of things within it. But if it's the traditional type 2, obesity is a driver, and that weight gets back down, about 70% of Americans, their bodies will start to produce insulin again. 30%, the damage is done. For that 30%, at the end of the decade, there looks like there's hope. These are 4 just simple moral steps that are great economics. So we're going to come here and complain about the debt and deficit, but at least I'm standing here and giving you one idea that actually can pass this body. Unlike some of the fake budgets that the left and even some of my friends, we will roll out here that will just be pretty words, no math. And we'll say, you see, I can get you there if we just pretend that we're going to grow at this rate and get rid of all of government. I will argue, and I have the math to prove it, that the path of taking on diabetes and its primary causes is the most elegant, most moral, and something it can pass and get a presidential signature. If someone else has a better idea that equals trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of savings in the 10 years, please send it to me. I'm happy to steal brilliant ideas. But Mr. Speaker, how do we get our brothers and sisters who are all smart? Some are more smart than others, but our brothers and sisters at work here, whether it be staff, whether it be elected members, to understand sounding like it's the 1990s policy-wise isn't going to save us. And the numbers are crashing dramatically faster than any of us even expected a few months ago. There's a path, there is hope. But the hope only exists if we actually start dealing with the realities of a path that's actually doable. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. You ready? Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9, 2023, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Santos, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nearly 50 years ago, during the Cold War, Soviet Russia was the enemy of the people and the biggest threat to the free world. Fast forward to 2023, and it appears that history is repeating itself once again as the threat of nuclear annihilation comes full circle as 2 opposing ideological blocs dominate the world. General Secretary Xi Jinping has imitated Soviet Russia's playbook ever since he came to power more than 20 years ago. The Chinese Communist Party has built a cabal of global partners throughout predatory and oppressive investments in foreign countries, political strong-arming, stealing American technology, and strengthening ties with anti-American tyrannical leaders. This plan is taken straight from the Soviet playbook. Only this time, China is infinitely stronger than the Soviet Union ever was. The United States must recognize and take immediate action against China's push for influence in the developing world. The Soviet Union used military might and territory conquest to forge strategic alliances and expand its influence past the Iron Curtain. However, China mainly uses economic sway and exploits our globalized economic system to expand. Over the past 2 decades, China has emerged as a critical trading partner for many regions and developing countries across the globe and it is not by coincidence. China is intentionally targeting less developed countries to popularize its authoritarian model and undermine developing democracies worldwide. China's strategic approach is rendering explicit in Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, aka the BRI, a lending gambit that grants China's allies over 140 nations billions of dollars under the pretense of economic integration and interconnected development. China has bought up so much copper, pork, and soy and constructed so many roads, trains, power grids, and bridges that it surpassed the U.S. as South America's largest trade partner and is now Brazil, Chile, and Peru's single largest trading partner. Compared to the U.S. and the EU, Latin America's bilateral trade in goods with China grew dramatically from $14.6 billion in 2001 to $315 billion in 2020. That is a 21.5-fold increase since Beijing joined the World Trade Organization. These insidious tactics have made China an undeniable economic superpower throughout unbounded dishonesty and underhanded manipulation. In 2019, China, an active trade partner of the U.S., allowed the yuan to fall below the 7-to-1 yuan to U.S. dollars peg it had maintained since 2015. This action set off a day of intense selling in global markets, and in the U.S., the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 2.9%, its worst daily decline all year. By devaluing its currency, China could effectively undercut competitors in the marketplace by offering lower prices on its exports and, according to the U.S. Treasury Department, gained an unfair competitive advantage in international trade. Intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, forced technology transfer, widespread product dumping, and currency manipulation are just a few of the economic warfare tactics used by the Chinese Communist Party. This brings me to my next point. One of China's most recent efforts to destabilize the United States involves forging an unofficial alliance with Russia to maintain Vladimir Putin's power at all costs. China is also the top trader with Russia and Ukraine. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, China had already surpassed Germany and the U.S. as Russia's most significant commercial partner and the largest consumer of its oil and gas. China has provided a financial lifeline to Russia over the past year by buying goods that the West won't and helping Russia continue to access financial markets despite harsh Western sanctions. China not only accounted for the highest year-over-year rise in export volume to Russia of any country in 2022, but it was also the largest exporter to Russia overall. Moving on, it is no secret that Putin and Xi are determined to end the U.S. and create what Xi called a new model of major country relations. Sure enough, they have had great success in forming the BRICS bloc and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, whose citizens comprise 2/3 of the world's population. China has been expanding its military production capabilities and is now the world's 4th largest arms exporter. There has been a drastic 80% increase in Chinese military sales to regions across the globe throughout the last decade. A growing number of United States defense officials are expressing concerns about China's swift military modernization. At this rate, the United States cannot keep up with their prices and turnaround, especially in regions like the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. Between 2017 and 2020, Chinese arms exports to sub-Saharan Africa outpaced the United States by a ratio of nearly 3-to-1. China has spread its malevolent influence this far simply because China is determined to bolster our enemies and supplement them with whatever they need to undermine democracy and our sovereignty. China has allied with other iron-fisted regimes who are presently in the crosshairs of the U.S. sanctions, including some of the world's most monstrous dictators, such as Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela and Russia's Vladimir Putin. China has shipped more than $12 million in drones to Russia since it invaded Ukraine, indicating quiet collaboration between the two. And recently, Chinese state-affiliated entities sold metals and centrifuges to corporations affiliated with Iran's Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics to aid in constructing Iran's first hypersonic missile, which amplifies Iran's nuclear capabilities. Despite debt-trapping Venezuela, China has remained their steadfast ally, negotiating payment grace periods and concealing trades. China has even gone so far as to support a veto of the 2019 U.S.-backed resolution in the United Nations calling for free and fair presidential elections. The Maduro regime has become reliant on China for disinformation campaigns and social control programs, including an ID card that serves as a scorecard of loyal Venezuelan citizens to the regime. Close to $68 billion in loans have been given to Venezuela by China since 2007. Plus, around 490 agreements have been signed in diverse areas of investment. The exact nature of these investments is still yet to be made public, but essentially everything comes down to extracting Venezuela's rich mineral supply. In addition, some of these quiet deals encompass state-affiliated entities that have sold over $615 million worth of weapons to Venezuela in the past 8 years. This is the perfect example of the kind of mischief, destabilization the CCP is known for, preying on other countries via unsustainable and corrupt lending while ignoring global labor and environmental standards for their own economic gain. Even with their own country, the CCP will only continue to enhance their economic development. Forced labor has become common practice and a part of the CCP's plan for Xi Jinping's economic development, which includes making it a hub of textile and apparel manufacturing. In fact, tens of thousands of Uyghurs detained in concentration camps for religious persecution were sent to factories throughout China linked to 83 global brands. To cover up a mass genocide and enslavement of the Uyghur people, Chinese officials called the policy poverty alleviation. More than 1 million Uyghurs are locked up in camps in their homeland or blindfolded and transported to prison by truckloads. Brutal crimes against Uyghur women, including forced sterilization and abortion, have been carried out to diminish the Uyghur population. Children are taken away from their parents and under pressure to deny their Uyghur ancestry. China's deep pockets have left its partners notably silent. Prioritizing their economic ties and strategic relationships with China, many other foreign governments continue to ignore human rights abuses. Taking another page from the Soviet Russia's book, propaganda, censorship, and disinformation are pillars of the CCP's grand strategy towards world domination. Their goal is to make the state and its objective appear favorable to the world, while simultaneously manipulating markets, lying, cheating, and stealing to fuel its ceaseless attack on democracy. The COVID pandemic was the perfect example of what kind of the propaganda the Chinese Communist Party is known for. Millions of Americans died of the coronavirus, which the epidemic was first reported in Wuhan, a city in central China. However, instead of alerting the global community in the early stages of the outbreak, the CCP sought to cover up the severity of the coronavirus outbreak, but also to carry out a great propaganda campaign downplaying the severity of COVID-19. Attempting to shift responsibility and hide the origins of the virus, I would hope the Biden administration and Congress would be willing to step up to the plate and finally take a different approach towards preventing and protecting the American people from the CCP's unrelenting attempts to infringe on our national security. I hope that as leaders of the free world, we will take proactive steps to counter the CCP's threat towards democracy and efforts to infiltrate our sovereignty. This is why I have introduced several bills that would hold China accountable and protect our nation's innovation, ideas, and way of life. Instead, we have senior officials of the DOJ colluding with the CCP to have Chinese political asylees exiled from the United States to be tortured and killed by CCP agents. We have a president who promises to buy American, but vetoes legislation that has reinstated tariffs on solar panels from Chinese companies in Southeast Asia. We have an administration actively allowing the CCP to dodge responsibility for COVID. Drug traffickers are smuggling fentanyl produced by China into the United States through our unsecured borders, killing millions of Americans while benefiting China from a weakening America due to the fentanyl epidemic. There are ways we can legislate to make a safer, more secure, and better America for the next generation. Here are 10 bills I have introduced to counter the threat imposed by the Chinese Communist Party. House Concurrent Resolution 51, a concurrent resolution that makes it the opinion of Congress that the Chinese Communist Party is the greatest threat to freedom in the free world. House Resolution 4001, which includes a provision to prohibit the United States from selling weaponry to the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. House Concurrent Resolution 52, a concurrent resolution condemning Cuba and the Chinese Communist Party for discussing and implementing an agreement to build a Chinese Communist Party spy base on the island of Cuba, 90 miles from the United States coast. House Resolution 4000, a bill to authorize the United States to bring civil actions against the government of the People's Republic of China for harm suffered by the state as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. House Resolution 3757, a bill to prohibit the availability of federal funds to institutions of higher education that fund the Confucius Institutes. House Resolution 3664, a bill to prohibit the availability of federal funds to the World Health Organization pending the conduct of an investigation relating to the influence over such organization by the Chinese Communist Party and for other purposes. House Resolution 3598, a bill to direct the Secretary of State to conduct a comprehensive study assessing the Chinese Communist Party's role in the distribution of fentanyl in the United States. House Resolution 3597, a bill to direct the President to impose sanctions on the People's Republic of China. House Concurrent Resolution 48, a bill to condemn the Chinese Communist Party for the Wuhan lab leak causing the deadly COVID-19 pandemic. House Resolution 421, a resolution expressing the sense of the House of Representatives that the Chinese Communist Party should be held accountable for present-day efforts of knowingly and intentionally manipulating their currency. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow.